On May 25, 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 crashed just after takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare Airport. Intriguing synchronicities attended this tragic event, beginning with one of its doomed passengers, the brilliant scientist, inventor, mystic, and philosopher Itzhak Bentov. According to psychologist Jean Malloy, weeks before the flight, Bentov had proposed a group-focused telekinesis experiment for that May 25th. Bentov, and I quote Malloy here, suggested that people in a variety of locations might focus their minds together to prevent a very heavy Russian satellite from falling on a populated area. It was already doomed to fall back to Earth and could cause great devastation. Bentov suggested that we use psychokinesis simultaneously to lift the object to a higher orbit, or to send it to the ocean. Beryl Payne took up the suggestion and mailed letters to large groups of people, listing the exact time for the experiment in a variety of time zones. He also announced the project on radio and TV. As the time approached for the group to focus their combined mind energy on the space object, Bentov boarded a plane from the Chicago O'Hare Airport. He was scheduled to give a workshop about his research in Los Angeles. Then, at the exact time the group began to focus on the attempt to raise the Russian object to a higher orbit, one of the engines of the plane Bentov was on dropped from the sky. The plane crashed, and all on board were killed. The tragic synchronicity of both events was shocking to all of us. His colleague, Sinella, flew to Los Angeles to conduct the workshop in memory of his friend. Yet as sad as he was at the loss of his friend, he felt that even Bentov would understand the karmic humor of both events, and might have laughed all the way down to the crash site. Another victim with a synchronicity was author Judith Wax. She was on her way to Los Angeles to promote her new book, Starting in the Middle, about middle-aged life. Her synchronistic twist of fate, or coincidence, can be found on page 191 of her book, the same number as the flight, where she describes her fear of flying in airplanes. Quote, "When the job required travel, I developed such a fear of airplanes, my head trembled from takeoff to landing." And as frequently attends mass public disasters, such as the Titanic or 9/11, there was at least one credible account of a vague but powerful premonition. Not quite second sight, but hardly negligible. For among those who were scheduled to be on board Flight 191 were Lindsay Wagner, the Bionic Woman, and her mother. In Wagner's own words, quote, "My mother and I were booked on the American Airlines DC-10 that crashed shortly after takeoff at the Chicago airport. But 10 minutes before we were due to get on, I had a psychic flash that warned me of disaster. I begged my mother to change our flight, and an hour later, we learned that all 271 people on board had been killed. I haven't doubted a single premonition since." None of these examples, of course, would compel us to not doubt second sight. But what about this well-documented second sight vision of David Booth, filmed as part of Arthur C. Clarke's televised series on premonitions?
Everybody talks about a dream, and everybody has dreams. I didn't have a dream, I had a vision.
David Booth is still haunted today by what he lived through over 25 years ago.
The dream would always start out in the same way. It was a bright, sunlit day, and I'm looking at a very large airport and a very long runway. And there's a really large plane, and I can see American Airlines. I see the plane starting to taxi on the runway, and it gathers up speed. All of a sudden, as it's going off, there's a perception in my mind that there's something wrong with the sound that the engine is making. The plane all of a sudden seems to go almost go straight up in the air, and then it turns just like this, and then goes straight down into the ground and explodes in this humongous inferno, and then this wave of despair, just like a physical object would just hit you right in your chest. Next morning, the same thing, the same time, right in waking up. And it wouldn't stop. I've got to do something about this. What can I do about this? The only thing that I knew to do was to call the FAA. And that's what I did, fully expecting to just have the phone hung up at me.
David sounded perfectly sane and credible. There was nothing kooky about him at all. He'd had a disturbing dream 7 nights in a row. He had a problem, and I listened to him. It was my job to do that.
Every day it got worse and worse and worse. Not knowing what to do, not knowing what I was supposed to do. Not being able to forget. An image seared not just into my mind, but into the very fabric of my entire being.
Well, I would talk to him and listen to him. David's dream didn't give you enough information to do anything with. It didn't give a location, it didn't give a flight, some numbers which didn't make any sense. And I said, well, thank you. There's nothing we can do about it, but thank you for the information.
May 25th, 1979. I knew I'll never have this dream again. It's going to happen soon.
On Friday morning, he called again to our Cincinnati office, and then he patched back into me and said he'd now had the dream 10 nights in a row.
Got up, went to work. I was at work for 15 minutes when the phone rang. Dave, I'm sorry to tell you, American Airlines DC-10 just crashed an hour ago on takeoff. Nobody survived.
In Chicago, taking off from O'Hare Airport, a silver American Airlines airplane that had an engine in the tail crashed, not inverted, but turning, after it passed over an abandoned hangar, a low building. It hit me as to how accurate he was. What he dreamed was, in fact, basically what happened. You've got to experience that to understand how eerie it is.
I still think about, and I always still wonder, was there anything else that I could have done? Was there anything else Jack could have done?
I don't think there's any way that David could have done any more than he did. You've got to remember, in aviation alone, there's over 20 to 25,000 flights a day by the scheduled airlines. So it's difficult to pinpoint a particular future event. In the 30 years I was with FAA, that was the only time anybody ever called in with any kind of a dream like that I'm aware of.
I'm not the only one that these things happen to. I'm just the stupid fool that actually called the FAA before it happened.